as well as the abstract for this session. So without further ado, I would like to start by introducing Mr. Ramesh Rajasingham, who is head and representative OCHA in Geneva and the director of the coordination division since 2018. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And it's a great pleasure and honor to be here with all of you today to discuss inclusion. What I'd like to do is just perhaps give you a quick overview of where we are in the humanitarian field today. And then it'll also give an indication of how inclusion features in our work. In 2023, we appealed for $55 billion to directly target 250 million people. And those 250 million people obviously are the most vulnerable because we estimated that the people in need was above 300 million. So we were really looking at the most vulnerable population out of the 300 million. We received less than 40% of what we asked for. And instead of reaching 250 million people, we reached 130 million people at best. Perhaps not on a regular basis, but we reached 130 million at some form or another. Now, we did not reach tens of millions because of lack of resources. We did not reach millions because of lack of access. And among those millions that we didn't reach, obviously you'll find some of the people who are furthest left behind. And I think this is where inclusion is so important in our work, and what we would like to do to make sure that we invest much more in this part of our work in terms of addressing the most vulnerable populations. Most of our displacement today comes from conflict, and when you have a situation like that, obviously the ones who are most affected are the ones who are furthest left behind. Those are the women, people with disabilities, women, children, ethnic minorities. They do bear the brunt because they were the least served even when the situation was stable. So what we would like to do this year is we've appealed. We've really looked at our figures and tried to prioritize even further. So we're appealing for about $46 billion to assist 180 million people. It's not that the number of people who need have dropped. It's just that we understand that the funding is much more limited this year. And if we want to try and really address those ones who are furthest left behind, the ones who often miss out on assistance, we need to be much more prioritized in terms of how we address them. So they are among the 180 million, and we really hope that we'll get sufficient funding to reach them. We still have about 300 million people in need, at least 300 million people in need in this coming year. As we navigate in 2024, the trends in humanitarian action are alarming. As I mentioned, over 300 million people now need humanitarian assistance due to conflict, climate emergencies, and other drivers. So basically, we are seeing three major drivers, which is conflict, which is the major driver of displacement. Climate change is having an enormous impact, and it's already in the house, not on the doorstep. And thirdly, the economic impact of COVID. So it's the three C's basically. The economic impact of COVID devastated social safety nets, again, in those countries, in middle-income countries where there was no previous humanitarian operation. And when you destroy a social safety net, again, the people who are most affected are the ones who are most vulnerable, and those are the ones who in many ways have been excluded from a lot of these programs. So they have now come into our fold. So we have a lot of middle-income countries within these within what we would call the humanitarian cluster, among the 181 million people that we're trying to support. But that gap between needs and resources is going to continue, and from all indications that we've had from donors, etc., it looks like that's not going to change. And this has major consequences for us. Millions will be left without essential aid. Life-saving assistance will be curtailed. Rations will be cut. So it's therefore even more vital that the most marginalized and the hardest to reach are not neglected, and that inclusion is not seen as a mere checkbox, or as something that's nice to have in our programming, or is contingent on funding, but is an essential part of life-saving humanitarian action. And so whatever we have has to really focus primarily on ensuring inclusion, because once we do that, we do reach the most vulnerable. The increased emphasis on inclusion at this HNPW, with 35 sessions and exhibitions devoted to the topic this year, demonstrates a growing system-wide understanding of the need for a qualitative and inclusive response. And by recognizing diverse needs and capacities, we can shape humanitarian responses. This is central to our OCHA's strategic plan for this current strategic plan, which ends in 2026, which aims to drive transformative change in the humanitarian system. And one part of this is what we call the flagship project, which we have launched in the Philippines, South Sudan, Niger, and Colombia. Colleagues are encouraged to explore innovative ways there to assess needs, analyze responses, and involve affected populations, not just in consultations, but in the actual decision-making process on the direction of programming. So we're taking steps to mainstream the inclusion of persons with disabilities as part of our policies and tools. So they'll have a representation at the decision-making table, including in our own localization agenda, our lightened humanitarian programming cycle, and our accountability frameworks. In 2023, our pool funds supported over almost 5 million people with disabilities, almost 14% of all the people assisted. For example, in Nigeria, the fund there allocated funds to advance disability inclusion, while pooled funds in Lebanon supported a local NGO that assists families of people with disabilities. In this year, 3 important milestones stand out in the humanitarian community: the 5-year mark for the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy and for the IAC guidelines on persons with disabilities in humanitarian action. Security Council Resolution 2475, also passed in 2019, marked the first time that the Security Council called for the protection of persons with disabilities in conflict-affected settings and underscored the importance of ensuring their full participation in the decision-making process. And despite these milestones, their implementation remains incomplete. And looking at the Council resolution, for example, which is the focus of this session, the challenges yet to be tackled range from the dynamics of armed conflicts and the lack of disability-inclusive approaches to bureaucratic hurdles, the lack of adherence to international humanitarian law, the absence of monitoring mechanisms for the resolution, and resource constraints. Of course, efforts to overcome these challenges go way beyond the humanitarian context. But at least from our side, we have to make sure we advance this project and shape that conversation. And from the OCHA's perspective, we're also increasing our investment in humanitarian diplomacy. And that really will focus on bringing, at least reducing the vulnerability, not just rolling it back, but also in a preventive sense. And inclusion will be very much a part of that humanitarian diplomacy. The impact of armed conflicts on persons with disabilities serves as a stark reminder. As I mentioned before, inclusion has to be central in our project. And as we strive to build on a more just and equitable world, we must not forget those who are often left behind in times of crisis, when we have promised to address them the first. So we have to amplify their voices, honor their resilience, knowing that we cannot depend on the resilience without any sort of support from our side, and build a world where everyone counts. Thank you very much for this opportunity and for your attention.
Thank you so much for those opening remarks. That you set the stage very well, I think, from one perspective of the fact that the funding is not there, but also the amount of individuals in need. I'm not going to take up too much more time. I will remind all the speakers that we have a very short time limit to ensure that we stick to it, but we'll do our best. What we're going to do now is there will be next 3 parts. The first part will be the context setting, and that will see speakers from the field and persons with disabilities. The next part will be discussion of actual operations from the field, and the third section will be and intersectional perspective. So we're going to move now to the first part on the context setting. I don't have much time, but I will give a quick overview. My name is William Pons, and I should have done this earlier. I will be the moderator for this event, and I am the former senior legal advisor to the former Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, Mr. Gerard Quinn. During that work, if you are familiar with it, we focus heavily on international humanitarian law and disability and the intersection between the two and the gaps that exist. Just to say that we did conduct in the field consultations with the assistance of the ICRC and OPDs to have consultations between militaries and organizations of persons with disabilities. And I just want to highlight 5 gaps that were identified in this consultations. If you're interested, there is a report that was published in 2022 for the 77th session of the General Assembly by the UN Special Rapporteur, former UN Special Rapporteur, Mr. Gerard Quinn. So you can look at the longer version of this. But the 5 main areas where there were failures to fully consider and protect persons with disabilities was in the accessibility of communication, their exclusion during evacuation procedures, the enhanced risk of sexual and gender-based violence, gaps in disability data, and the lack of engagement with the disability community as a whole between the military and humanitarian response organizations. These shouldn't come as surprises to most of us here at this event, but as a common theme throughout. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Ms. Nujeen Mustafa. She is a Syrian refugee and disability rights advocate. She's joining us online. Nujeen, please, with your intervention, go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nujeen Mustafa. I was born with cerebral palsy and I use a wheelchair. In 2015, I fled the war in Syria to Germany. In April 2019, I was invited to be the first person with a disability to brief the UN Security Council on the particular impact that the war in my country, Syria, has had on people with disabilities. I hope that my briefing would be a wake-up call for the international community to recognize the lack of protection for people with disabilities. And my dream did come true. A few months after my briefing, the UN Security Council adopted the resolution that we are talking about today. A resolution committing to the protection of people with disabilities. But from what I have seen, nothing has practically changed for people with disabilities in places plagued by war or a humanitarian crisis. In October, I spoke with Badr Musleh, a disability rights defender in Gaza. He told me that he was unable to flee his home despite the bombardment. As a man with a visual disability, he said it was difficult to flee and that there was no safe or accessible place to go. He told me that he feared for the lives of his 3 young children and whether he would be able to protect them. This resonated so much with me because I've been there, unable to flee the attacks on my neighborhood and risking not only my life, but also the lives of my family as well. I was lucky to survive. Unfortunately, Badr wasn't. On December 7th, he was killed. When I spoke to him in October, he asked me to deliver a message and to call for the protection of people with disabilities in Gaza. He said, and I quote, "The consciousness of humanity should wake up. We people with disabilities cannot survive this." End quote. Following this call, I met with government and UN officials. I raised the concern that evacuation orders in Gaza did not take into account the rights and needs of people with disabilities. I also raised the concern that people with disabilities in Syria continue to face numerous abuses and obstacles, including access to education and humanitarian aid. People often ask me if I feel like I've been heard. The individuals that I've spoken to have definitely listened to me. But when a conflict breaks out, there are so many competing priorities that people with disabilities simply get lost. We are not considered as an integral part of the response to a crisis. Just because it's in the guidelines written on paper does not mean it will translate into tangible action on the ground. I often wonder why we are always the ones who are not prioritized under the excuse of so many competing priorities. We have known for a while that people with disabilities are disproportionately affected by violent conflict. So why are we still not a part of every effort to prevent it, respond to it, and recover from it? One reason is because we have been regulated to the role of victims or so-called beneficiaries, and not seen as as partners who are capable of making meaningful contributions. The other reason is the lack of an accountability mechanism for failing to ensure the protection of people with disabilities. Finally, the topic of disability and conflict is still not automatically included in the political and diplomatic discourse surrounding conflict. So, so here are some critical next steps that we people with disabilities call on you to take. We need an understanding that not all disability is the same. I often hear humanitarians say that 5 to 10% of their beneficiaries are people with disabilities. First, 5 to 10% is not enough. When in a country like Syria, 28% of the population has a disability. But what I've also seen is that they do not include all, all people with disabilities equally, and people with intellectual, developmental, and psychosocial disabilities are usually left behind. What I've also seen, as in the case of a 4-year-old girl in Syria who was provided with an adult wheelchair which was too big for her, is that often humanitarian aid does not is not that is provided clearly does not meet our needs. Humanitarian aid should not be sent to fill a quota, but to fulfill its purpose. When conflicts erupt, we also need access to information. Where can I flee as someone who cannot move easily? Where does Badr, who cannot see, go? Access to information that responds to our unique needs will maximize our chances of survival. For all of that to happen, we need a change on a systematic level. We need dedicated awareness and targeted funding. Governments should include explicit references and allocate resources to people with disabilities and their representative organizations, their budgets. Finally, the UN Security Council Resolution 2475 needs to be translated into country-specific action. While children and women are rightly part of every UN Security Council debate and discussion, they are not. Resolution 2475 is will be 5 years old next June, and it is time for all people with disabilities in areas of conflict to feel its positive impact in their lives. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that very pointed and direct intervention, Najin. It is very welcome. I would like to now introduce the next speaker, Ms. Gunta Ancha. She is the Vice President of the European Disability Forum and the head of the Latvian umbrella body for disability organizations, which provide crucial support to Ukrainians with disabilities inside and outside Ukraine. She's joining us online. Please go ahead with your intervention.
Hello, everyone, and I'm really happy to be here today to speak more with you. I have 4 points I would like to highlight it for you today, because the question was, what kind of changes do we have in a 2.5 years of the war in Ukraine? And I have these 4 points I'd like to introduce you now. The first one.
Please, everyone online, if you are not speaking, can you please mute yourself? Thank you so much. My apologies. Ms. Ansha, please go ahead.
Okay, and those points are, the first one is from house to system. When the war started, nobody in Europe knows what exactly to do in that situation. I get a call from my friends in Ukraine by saying, you know, our shelters are not accessible. We never thought about it. Nobody thought about the accessible information, accessible infrastructure, accessible role for people with disabilities. Now, I would say we are much more clever. We have more systematic in understanding what kind of support people with disabilities do need. I'm sorry to say, in Europe, in 21st century, to be more accessible and to be more included. My next point is from general approach to individual approach. And that is about humanitarian aid. It is about humanitarian aid, which we are sending to different countries and also to Ukraine, to people in general, to people with disabilities. And then during one conference, when I said, do you understand that, for example, wheelchairs, they are just like a shoes, they are different sizes, and you can't just give a wheelchair to a person by saying that's good for you. You need a very special kind to make those people really feel active and feel included. Then we understood that humanitarian aid in general doesn't work for people with disabilities. And that is something what we do at the moment by support of European Disability Forum, by support of CBM, by support of many donors. We are sending directly to individuals humanitarian aid, which is exactly needed. And there is not only wheelchairs, there are so many important things for those people to be included and to feel safe in a country, even if there is a war. The next part is from segregated services to mainstream services. And now we are talking about accessibility. So many people would like to leave Ukraine when the war started. And only then we understood, okay, there is no even trains accessible for people in wheelchairs. We are not talking about many things which are not accessible because the mainstream accessibility is not yet in place. And that is what we need to do as far as possible and as fast as possible to prepare services, not especially for people with disabilities, but prepare services which are for everybody, including people with disabilities. All those services should work during a wartime. And the last but not the least point, we can't work ourselves. Our organization started alone by trying from Latvia to help people with disabilities in Ukraine. But very fast we understand that it's not possible. We understood that we need cooperation partners. We need someone who are together with us. So we are together with European Disability Forum. We are together with many donors. We are together with many UN agencies. And only together we can do a situation better for people with disabilities. For those people with disabilities in Ukraine, and for those people with disabilities who are outside Ukraine, like refugees in different countries. And our motto is nothing about us without us. So we are very happy about this session and about possibility to speak, to provide interests of people with disabilities in a session like this. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Anka and Ms. Mustafa. So thank you both also for keeping in wonderful times so that we are ahead of pace a little bit, even though we're behind. So as it always goes, I would like to say that this is a very well set scene for the next discussion that will take a different sort of bent. Instead of having individual speakers. I mean, there will be individual speakers, but we're going to try to do it in a bit more of a panel discussion. So if it's okay with the speakers here in front of me, I will go from my left and then come back asking you the three questions that have been posed that we have shared with you previously. So at this point, I'd like to move on to the next discussion, which is part 2 about discussions about some field operations. And we're not speaking about all of them because there's very many. So first, I would like to introduce Mr. Pascal Cross. To my left, the Director of Innovation and Development at Humanity Inclusion. Next to also online, we actually have, Miss Laura Bill, who is Deputy Special Representative from UNICEF, the Palestine office. We have Mr. Per Lodhammer, who is at the end of the dais here. He is the Chief Mine Action Programmer. He's Chief Mine Action Program in Iraq for UNMAS Iraq. And then in between Pascal and Per, we have Mr. Michael Mwandi. Michael, say it again. Mendua, my apologies, who is Disability Inclusion Advisor and Accountability to Affected People Unit at the International Committee of the Red Cross. So for our panelists, I know there is a variation in some of the questions. So what I will do actually will be to start with Per and ask you, sir, the first question is how are you identifying and working with OPDs and including persons with disabilities in your work in Iraq?
Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak today. So I've been the Chief Mine Action Program in Iraq for the last seven years. I have about 10 years of experience from Iraq, so I would talk very much from a mine action perspective, but I was also asked to speak briefly about my military experience from Sweden. Unfortunately, that was a while ago. It was 24 years ago, so I decided to talk a little bit about my experience, but also wanted to speak from the perspective of protection, as my experience dates back to 1999. So recently I have engaged in the topic of EWIPA quite a lot, explosive weapons in populated areas. And one of the challenges and shortcomings identified in my home country, Sweden, which must address is a question of protection of persons with disabilities and protection during conflict, and especially as conflict has moved more and more into urban and populated areas. In Sweden, most of the protection and shelter facilities were built 40 or 50 years ago. And based on experience from Ukraine, there is a massive need now to adopt these facilities and to make them accessible and usable by persons with disabilities. In the case of Iraq, going back to that question, we conduct mapping of organizations for persons with disabilities. Both governmental entities and humanitarian organizations do this and engage in the areas where they operate. In Iraq, implementing partners, international NGOs, commercial entities, as well as national NGOs communicate with organizations for persons with disabilities to facilitate referral when identifying persons with disabilities during implementation of our operational activities, including explosive ordnance risk education, community liaison, and also as part of victim assistance, which is one of the 5 pillars in mine action. Implementing partners and UNMAS, we also arrange relevant disability workshops and events, and humanitarian mine action organizations encourage the inclusion of persons with disabilities in their work. And several of our implementing partners have several persons with disability staff members, both in not only administrative roles, but also in technical roles. Thank you.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. And I'm going to come back because the third question that we posed to our panelists is the same as it relates to Security Council 2475. So what I would like to do actually is to go online and ask Ms. Laura Bill to provide an answer to the question on how you identify and work with persons with disabilities and OPDs. And then we'll go down the line and ask the same question of the ICRC and HI, and then we'll discuss, I guess, a little bit, I think, on how implementation actually looks of Security Council Resolution 2475. So, Ms. Bill, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, and good afternoon to everybody. And it's great to have this opportunity to be with all of you. So I've been working in UNICEF for a number of years, and currently I'm based in Jerusalem, and I'm working for UNICEF State of Palestine. And, you know, as an organization, we have obviously a number of policies and strategies that are guiding our work with, you know, children, working with children with disabilities in particular. But also those policies and strategies also help us and guide us through our work in humanitarian action. And we have been, as you all know, we've been facing a large-scale emergency, in particular in the Gaza Strip, following the events that happened on October 7th. And I think what has been very important for UNICEF here has been that from the onset of the emergency, we have decided to go for a, you know, disability-friendly humanitarian response. And what that really means in practical terms is that we have, you know, decided to apply a twin track approach to disability inclusion, meaning that we have, you know, come up and developed some mainstreaming interventions, but also targeted interventions. For that, we have, you know, we have partnered with organizations, with people with disabilities, and also with other partners that have good knowledge of disability inclusion. And I think that has been key in terms of, you know, achieving some concrete results as of today. For instance, some of the results that we were able to achieve was to provide psychosocial support to children, including also children with disabilities. We have been able to identify and refer children with disabilities to specialized services. Our humanitarian cash program has been also focusing and targeting families with children with disabilities, or also adults, you know, living with disabilities. And we have had also in some of the construction work that we've been able to implement, also taken into account the needs of people with disabilities. I think all this wouldn't have been possible if we wouldn't have had, you know, earmarked budgets for that. We have also, you know, dedicated human resources within the office that is helping with that, and we have been also able to get support from the organization as a whole for helping us in ensuring disability inclusive response. Thank you.
Observations that we had from these resolutions and other areas that I've mentioned. Secondly, we have also, as an organization, efforts towards intersectional identification of persons with disabilities. And this is quite key and important because normally we cannot engage, we cannot have persons with disabilities participate without identifying them. And I mean, for a very long time, I think we have had what we call the macro level social context analysis, the meso level. But now, inspired by this, we have now the micro level social context analysis, which we are using to continuously identify whom we might be missing. Then, of course, OPD mapping is in the offing. We've been doing this. We're planning to be rolling out this and doing this with our delegations, what some of us might refer to as country offices. Data disaggregation, we now have a framework for disability, sex, age, and disability data disaggregation. As I come to the close to winding up this, the third aspect is about actually identification of barriers to participation at 3 levels. And we have mechanisms for this. I don't have time to go through all this, but 3 levels, meaning infrastructure, communication barriers, as well as access to services. Then lastly on this, meaningful participation, of course, as I said at the beginning, is very important. This is what we ensure through, of course, consultations with persons with disabilities and their representative organizations. Accountability to persons with disabilities through the development of organizations of persons with disabilities with from OPD engagement protocols, as well as, of course, empowerment. We believe as the HPLC that we should be on top, TAP, and not on top of organizations of persons with disabilities, so providing the resources. And I think as I come to the last part of your question, one of the challenges we've been having about inclusion of persons with disabilities is actually making persons with disabilities visible. I mean, this has been a big challenge, especially for mainstream organizations like the ICRC. But of course, when recently I was reading a story about a certain corporate that I will not mention their name, and in all their directorate meetings, they have an empty chair to signify the voice of the customer. Now, I don't know, this is actually making the customer visible. And for me, this particular story was very, very interesting. Ladies and gentlemen, we cannot judge a fish by its ability to climb the tree. But most of the time, we need mainstream tailored interventions for persons with disabilities, for them to be able to, for us, because I'm also a person with a disability, to engage meaningfully. So lastly, I think it's not always easy, but it is possible. And therefore, I'd like to have a parting shot to encourage you that persistence wears out resistance. That's my advice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. A lot to think about there, and thank you for the challenge, that specific challenge about visibility. I do want to have reconnected to the internet, or is connected back to us, one of the two. I'd like to go back to Ms. Laura Bill, and just so you know where we are right now, I've combined questions 2 and 3, so feel free to answer questions 1, 2, and 3 in your intervention if you don't mind. Thank you so much. Sorry, Laura, just 1 second. You seem to be muted. I'm looking to our tech team to see how we can resolve that if possible. Keep going. Okay, could you give us a sound check? Ah, perfect. Thank you so much.
Yes. Okay, thanks a lot. I was just wondering because I heard myself
Talking through the first question, so I don't know if in Geneva you heard me responding to the first question. So if you would like me to repeat, or I should just continue to question number 2 and 3 together.
I think since you were cut off, I will give you permission to answer as your full answer. So please go ahead.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. So what I was saying in terms of the work that we are doing here in the state of Palestine, and how UNICEF works with organizations with people with disability. As many organizations, obviously we have a number of policies and strategies which are actually guiding our work with organizations with people with disability, but also to ensure disability inclusion, including in humanitarian settings. And obviously these policies and strategies do guide the work in the field. But I think what was very critical for us here on the onset of the large-scale emergency that is unfolding in the Gaza Strip following the events of October 7th in Israel, we had taken the decision from the onset to actually apply disability-friendly response. And for that, we have used the twin track approach to disability inclusion, which actually means that we have developed both mainstreaming interventions, but also targeted interventions. And for that, we have partnered with organizations of people with disabilities, and we have also partnered with partners who have knowledge on disability inclusion. And this has really helped us to reach concrete results on the ground in our response. For instance, we have been able to, provide also psychosocial support to children with disabilities. We've been able to identify them, refer them to different types of services. Our humanitarian cash transfer assistance has targeted families with children with disabilities, also people with disabilities. And in the little work that limited work that we have done on infrastructure, we've been also taking into account needs of, people or children with physical disabilities. I think what has been really critical also as part of our response is that we had an earmarked budget, and we have had dedicated personnel working on disability inclusion in the response. So that's for the first question.
Thank you so much, Laura. And if you want to go right ahead into question 2 and 3 to combine them to sort of give your assessment as how you've seen the impact of 2475 on your work at the field level, and also the like one main challenge that you've had in tackling this implementation, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Sure. I think overall the changes that we are seeing on the ground, and not necessarily in our context, but I would say in several contexts, is I think the level of awareness of the disproportionate impact of armed conflict on persons with disabilities. And I think this is really important. It is slow, the shift is slow, but nevertheless, there is an increased awareness across humanitarian workers, and also, different types of partners that are involved in the humanitarian response. We have also seen an increase in the capacity of humanitarian actors to apply the twin track approach that I mentioned before, basically looking at mainstreaming interventions, but as well as, targeted interventions for disability inclusion, and also overall, increased engagement with organizations with people with disability. And last but not least, I think also we are seeing a slight shift of also having more people with disability participating to decision-making processes. Now, in terms of some of the challenges, or one of the major challenge, in my view, is the monitoring mechanism of the resolution. I think some of the previous speakers have already mentioned or hinted to that. I think this is definitely leading to somehow a lack of accountability overall. So I think the monitoring mechanism for the resolution would be critical to ensure more accountability and more response towards people with disability. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. I will now go to Mr. Pascal Cross next to me for HI. Please go ahead, sir.
Thank you. As already mentioned by Michael, the resolution and the ISC guidelines were adopted the same year in 2019. And we consider that both definitely support one another to drive change. As part of the Disability Advisory Group led by UNICEF, we definitely witness some improvement in the humanitarian response plans, which more and more include the needs of people with disabilities. As well, we see that the protection cluster more and more gives attention to including disability part of the centrality of protection. And this is indeed a very important step. And we can see that again in our South Sudan example. In the past 2 years, HRPs have been more and more disability focused. And out of the 9 objectives, which are all of them focused on people with risk of marginalization, and vulnerability, 3 of them actively mention needs for people with disabilities. So that's definitely a good progress. Yet, if we want to be also clear on the actual deployment, when we look at these good objectives being really focusing on people with disabilities, we see that the HRP fell short on indicators. We can see that the indicators very quickly think about gender, age, displacement status, but then what about disability? And that you have the objectives, but you don't see the indicators. And here we are back on the comment that Michael already made earlier, is that without properly disaggregated data, disability remains invisible. So we really need to work on disaggregating data, but disaggregating does not just mean talking about disabilities. It means about what type of impairments, what are the gender, the age of each and every individual. To give you just two very simple examples, a blind woman or girl trying to find her way through the rubble in armed conflict has a very different challenge compared to a deaf minor who does not realize gunshots or doesn't hear warning escape alarms. So in this respect, we go back to the previous point, which is that it is essential to work with OPDs, not only on a global basis, but also to analyze the data, to definitely understand the needs individual by individual, family of individual by family of individual, and be able to build the actual solutions. Keep in mind that also the additional of impairments translate into the multiplying of vulnerabilities. And here we are getting into more complicated area we also have to deal with and tackle. So as a conclusion, I would say that we cannot start from scratch during a conflict the relationships with OPDs. Preparedness is key. Data have to be gathered and analyzed upfront, and the work has to be done upfront. And the trust and the relationships with OPDs needs a lot of work and a lot of years so that we are efficient during armed conflict. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to ask Mr. Pascal, do you have any challenge, a big challenge, one main challenge that you see with implementation? I know you listed data as a main one, but is there one as it relates specifically to 2475 that you see would be exceptionally helpful to assist? I know the data is important, but also just a thought.
I would say that definitely data is important, but I do believe that we underestimate the need to build strong trust with OPDs, the time that it takes to create rapport, to definitely be able to work together, to build capacities, and so that we all trust in each other, so that when time comes, we are really a team and we are in it together.
Perfect. Thank you so much. All right, and I think we are going to go all the way back to the beginning with Mr. Per Lodhammer. Same question for you. I think you did combine your first and second question related to Iraq, but if you want any more to engage on that as well, since you have been working there for 7 years, but also if you don't mind including an answer with regards to Security Council Resolution 2475 and implementation and some challenges that you've seen.
Certainly. Thank you very much. So again, going back to Iraq, perhaps, and UNMA specifically, so and a few of the achievements that have been made. So Iraq was one of the first, or the first country actually in the world to develop a national standard for victim assistance based on the International Mine Action Standards in July 2023. This was done by Human Inclusion, and the National Mine Action Authorities and relevant government entities, with the support from HI, worked jointly with the humanitarian mine action community and OPDs to develop these standards and identify roles and responsibilities of various disability stakeholders. And the fact that it was the first one amongst national standards, amongst all the national mine action authorities in the world, it's a big step, I believe. Subsequently, the government of Iraq also launched the National Mine Action Strategy in August 23. It is a very ambitious strategy which recognizes the role of the Iraqi National Mine Action Authority in adopting a rights-based approach to victim assistance. As a state party to numerous conventions related to the use of explosive weapons, the strategy emphasizes the overall mission of victim assistance for full and effective participation of explosive weapon survivors in society. In addition to this, the Commission for the care of persons with disabilities and special needs oversees the implementation of government policy related to the rights of persons with disabilities in Iraq. And the Commission and the Ministry of Labour and Social Affairs provide soft loan services, job opportunities, salaries of full-time appointees, and also grant full-time leave. Humanitarian mine action partners, subject to funding availability, have conducted psychosocial support activities and have also provided assistive aid devices. Humanitarian mine action actors have provided persons with disabilities in support training, in support of skills and knowledge to compete for job opportunities. From UNMAS side, globally, we now have a global advocate in Mr. Giles Dooley, who's met with several UN leaders and was also able to participate in several important meetings, including the symposium organized for the International Day for Mine Awareness and Assistance in Mine Action. And I've also participated during this week in the past, as well as the international meeting of Mine Action national directors. Now to some challenges, very briefly, one minute. Again, very much based on my experience from Iraq. In Iraq, we brought in, over the last 7 years, approximately $275 million in funding, which is a lot in the mine action sector, and especially considering that it's extra budgetary from 21 different donors. Out of that, for UNMAS, $50,000 was earmarked for victim assistance. So what I'm saying is that in terms of resource mobilization, it is a major challenge for us. And there is lack of donors providing funding for mine victim assistance. And as a consequence of this, there's also lack of specialized partners and their ability to implement. The challenge in Iraq is also the increased number of victims over the past years. We don't know why. We don't know if it is because of surveillance, if it's because of COVID or movement patterns, tourism, etc. But we have seen an increase in Iraq. A significant shortcoming in this Iraq setting is surveillance and data collection. There is significant underreporting. So what can we do? Raise the awareness of persons with disabilities, rights, and advocate for enhanced persons with disabilities inclusion in society, obviously. Advocate increasingly for the allocation of sufficient financial resources for victim assistance in mine action to provide medical care, socioeconomic support, and more. And improve strength and strengthen surveillance systems. And this also goes back to the challenges, as this requires additional funding and more funding attention. And I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much. There's quite a bit to take in. It's a lot of good work that is being done and a lot of advancement, but also these challenges seem to be somewhat systemic that we've talked about, and funding comes up often as well as data. But I would love to move on to the next section because I'm hoping that we'll have time for question and answer, but we'll see in a second. So we're going to now, first of all, I'd like to thank all my speakers, including Laura online, for putting up with the technical difficulties. Thank you. What we're going to do now is move to zoom in on intersectionality perspective. It was brought up a number of times that, and I think most people know, but it bears restating that the disability community is not a homogeneous group. There are women with disabilities, there are children with disabilities, there's non-binary individuals with disabilities, there's LGBTIQ persons with disabilities that have compounding factors there. So I am very happy to introduce this next section on the intersectionality and intersectional perspectives on this. We have two speakers, but what I wanted to do was sort of lay the groundwork initially to say that in a recently released 2024 State of the World Population Report, it was stated that women and girls with disabilities worldwide continue to face up to 10 times the amount, 10 times more gender violence, while also facing higher barriers to sexual and reproductive information and care. Despite these figures, women and girls with disabilities, as well as other marginalized women, however, remain largely invisible, which is another theme that we've seen throughout this panel. This is even more the case during armed conflict when the social structures and protections and services break down. So in this sense, there is also we've been talking about Security Council Resolution 2475, but there's only one short mention of women within that. So I think that it's important to really bring in the intersectional perspective, and the first part will be on age, gender, and inclusion. And our first speaker who will be online is Miss Osnat Lubrani, who until recently was the acting chief of UN Women's Humanitarian Section and Geneva office. So Miss Lubrani, and I hope I said that correctly,
Yes.
the floor is yours. There are two questions that we posed to you. So do you want me to pose them to you, or since you have them, do you just want to speak to them?
I think I will speak to them and try to be succinct in addressing both. But I would say that both from my experience working with UN Women, but also I think I'm the only one that's here representing, the role of a humanitarian coordinator and what the humanitarian country team can do and the UN country team can do, but also having been with the emergency directors group and having a chance to go on joint missions to Sudan, DRC, Haiti, Afghanistan, and Ethiopia. As was mentioned a lot, there's a lot of good work that's being done, and I would refer, the Ms. Gunta spoke about the situation in Ukraine, where I had an opportunity to work for several years. And just to show how important it is, we used to call the conflict before the Russian invasion, it was the oldest conflict in the world. And because the population was very old, even after the invasion, when I was talking to some of the governors in the eastern regions, the biggest challenge was old population that didn't want to move from the areas where there was fighting going on. They couldn't move, or they didn't want to move. Often older people, and many of them old women. I remember this one old woman who had in her 80s, who had a 60-year-old disabled son, just refused to move for all of these combination of reasons. And then came COVID, which meant that vulnerable population was all the more vulnerable, with no means of getting to them, no ways of getting medicines or getting them to medical centers. So I think that with the adoption of the resolution, what we did was that there was much more focus on and attention on what does it mean for our humanitarian work, both in terms of having a strategy, having a group that focuses on that. There was a special allocation during the COVID pandemic, just targeting support for the most vulnerable people affected by the fighting on the contact line. And so I think that makes a lot of difference in I think that the resolution has made a lot of difference in getting that really embedded within works of humanitarian country teams. I want to go back further to my experience working on, because I think what was not maybe addressed is the whole issue of sudden onset disasters that are also related to climate change or other or earthquakes. What I've learned from my work, particularly in the Pacific, is how particularly women who are carers for disabled members of the family or are disabled themselves are much more vulnerable to these kinds of situations, and are what we've learned is how important it is to ensure their inclusion, their participation in strategies for early warning systems, in prevention. And that's where I really want to reiterate, I think a lot of work has been done to involve women's organizations that specialize in support for women with disabilities. But that it's more than just inclusion, but really understanding what the needs are and what their opportunities are. I think it was mentioned, I think the facilitator mentioned that there's still, the whole issue of accessibility, evacuation, but also gender-based violence, which affects when women are disabled, they're even more vulnerable to gender-based violence. So that is another area that really needs that special support. And in terms of being able to respond, I want to say that involvement of local organizations, even to just identify where the disabled are. And here I want to refer to UN Women's intervention in Gaza, where accessibility was so difficult and is difficult now. But in terms of who to target, there's been work done that the women's organizations know where the most vulnerable families, single-headed households with disabled members or children. And that was in cooperation with WFP, we're able to identify where, when aid is able to get in, how you can really target the most vulnerable. I want to, maybe in the context of Gaza, also mention that when you're talking about disabled women, well, women and then disabled women, the huge challenges on WASH of access to WASH facilities is, I think it's difficult often in any circumstances, but there it's just reaches like a peak that I think is unimaginable, and that I think really needs to be taken into consideration as well. I think I'll stop. Well, maybe just one last point is that what I've learned is, and I think it was mentioned several times, I think targeted funding is very important, whether it's through country-based pooled funds or the UN Trust Fund to End Violence Against Women made special allocation. So that I think is very important. And I want to perhaps alert, going back to what Ramesh said at the outset of this session, that as much as there are good practices with the financing crunch, it was heartbreaking for me to meet disabled people who are not receiving the kind of assistance that they need. I was listening to one IDP in Ethiopia who was telling me about all of the other disabled people who were not able to flee from conflict, and I think the same is true. You hear terrible stories also in Gaza. So I think more efforts needs to be done also in terms of allocating dedicated resources and ensuring that support for people with disabilities is mainstream into the humanitarian operations. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that overview, and in detail, actually, you did both exceptionally well. So thank you so much, and explaining a bit more how practically it can be done to better include women with disabilities in the humanitarian action in particular. I'm going to move quickly now because I want to ensure enough time for all the speakers. So thank you so much. What the next topic we just spoke about age and gender and inclusion. What I would like to speak about now is actually children in armed conflict. As some of you may know, Miss Virginia Gamba made a strong statement during the opening session of the HNPW about the impact of armed conflict on children, and in particular children with disabilities. Her video, if you haven't seen it, is available on the HNPW virtual exhibition on inclusion resources. She also has a very good report on the lack of inclusion of children with disabilities in the CAC agenda. as well. So I would encourage you all to read that. And I would like to introduce our last speaker to discuss her work, particularly on children with disabilities in armed conflict. And it is Ms. Emina Chermovich, the Associate Director of Disability Rights at Human Rights Watch. Emina, thank you so much for your patience for this entire meeting. And I'm not going to pose you the questions because they've been shared with you, but I just wanted to sort of start with the first one and then let you speak through. But you've done quite a bit of research on the impact of armed conflict on persons with disabilities, but also children with disabilities in armed conflict. Based on your research, what is the story that really has touched you the most from that, and then sort of your main recommendations on the better protection and inclusion of children with disabilities in armed conflicts, and lastly, obviously, Security Council Resolution 2475 really doesn't speak towards children with disabilities. In your opinion, what else would be required to really ensure the full protection of children with disabilities in armed conflict? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Will, and it's really a pleasure to be part of this panel. And I thank also all the speakers who have just spoken before. I've really learned a lot. As to the story that's touched me the most, I wanted to speak about Ghazal. Ghazal is a 14-year-old girl with cerebral palsy from Gaza. She lost her wheelchair and other assistive devices in an attack on her home. And as she was escaping from the north of Gaza to the south, she actually begged her parents to leave her because she saw how tired they would get from carrying her. When I spoke to her mother told me it was the most painful experience in her life, hearing her daughter beg her, "Mama, leave me and save yourself." Her mother told me it was a very difficult feeling that can never be described. She said, and I'm quoting, "I was confused whether to stop while we were under bombardment or to leave Ghazal behind and walk." She explained how difficult it was to have to face that horrible decision and even thinking about the fact that she may will have to leave her child behind. When I spoke directly with Ghazal, who loved going to school and bragged to me about being one of the top students, I asked her to describe the impact of the hostilities on her. She said, I quote, "From the day the war broke out, they destroyed what was inside me." Ghazal is currently displaced in a camp in Rafah, and she can only use the toilet and the shower in case her sister and her mother help her, because the showers and the toilets are not accessible, and she also still doesn't have access to a wheelchair. When I asked her to describe what does it mean for her to not have access to her assistive devices, she simply said, like, "I need my device to walk." And now, as Israeli army is ordering people in Rafah to evacuate, I think about Ghazal's words. The last thing that she asked me when I spoke with her, she said, I'm quoting, "I'm afraid. What if they ask us to leave Rafah? How do I leave?" Ghazal's story affected me the most, not because it's unique, but to the contrary. I've heard so many testimonies like this since Human Rights Watch started investigating the impact of armed conflicts on people with disabilities almost a decade ago. Inability to flee, fears of being left behind, and losing assistive devices that are impacting their independence and their ability to survive a war. As to the main recommendation for better protection and inclusion of people with disabilities in armed conflict, I would first like to reiterate two main points that Nujeen made earlier and add a third one. The first point that Nujeen brought up today was meaningful inclusion, protection, and a change on a system level. Both donors and humanitarian actors must take deliberate and proactive measures to ensure people with different types of disabilities are systematically included in all humanitarian responses. As Nujeen mentioned, designating a general percentage without meaningful inclusion or providing 300 wheelchairs without assessing whether these wheelchairs are adequate for people who need to use them is not an adequate response nor meaningful inclusion. On participation, UN agencies should consistently and meaningfully consult people with disabilities and their representative organizations, including when relevant mechanisms conduct country visits. And they should ensure that people with different types of disabilities, something that we have heard over and over again today, are included in conflict prevention and peacekeeping efforts and the humanitarian response. The second point that Najeen made, and this is also part of my answer to your last question, Will, is Najeen made a point that for the resolution 2475 to actually, for the resolution to have impact on people with disabilities on the ground, there are certain steps that need to be taken. And she mentioned that it should be implemented in all country-specific discussions, reports, and resolutions at the UN. So there are several concrete examples of what that would mean. The one is truly to ensure that all debates that discuss conflict prevention and peace and on conflicts in general include a specific reference to the UN Security Council Resolution 2475, and also ensure for full, effective, and meaningful participation of men, women, and children with disabilities in the work of the Council. I know that I'm running out of the time, so I will skip through some of my points that I can share later in writing. But I did also want to mention and reiterate something that other speakers have spoken about today, and it is really data collection. And the fact that we still do not have enough evidence about the human rights violations faced by disabilities, and without active work, the full impact of disabilities will remain unclear. It includes protection efforts, including humanitarian responses to potentially miss or underserved a substantial marginalized group with particular needs. And just to briefly take us back to children with disabilities and the UN agenda on children in armed conflict. For years, we have been raising the concerns that children with disabilities are invisible in the UN discussions and documents. You know, when you look back at the 11 resolutions that the UN Security Council has adopted on children in armed conflict since 1999, there is like hardly any mention of children with disabilities. The UN Secretary General thematic and country-specific reports did not include or rarely mention children with disabilities. However, luckily, thanks to the advocacy by Najeen and commitments by many actors, including actors that spoke today and that have spoken at this event since the beginning of the week, including the Special Representative on Children in Armed Conflict, things have changed. The Special Representative on Children in Armed Conflict did publish a discussion paper on the impact of grave violations on children with disabilities, recognizing that children with disabilities are at elevated risk of grave violation, but also I was really pleased to see that the last two reports by the UN Secretary General on Children in Armed Conflict, which are annual reports, do mention children with disabilities. They are mentioned in the report as being particularly vulnerable. And the most recent reports from last year calls on the donor community to provide financial support to address the specific needs of children with disabilities, which take us back again to Najeen's recommendation to ensure that there is targeted funding to ensure that the rights and needs of people with disabilities are met. And the UN Security Council resolution from 2021 underlines the importance of providing assistance to children with disabilities who are affected by armed conflict and to ensure that their specific needs are addressed. And these changes in language are really refreshing. We just need a little bit more. So what I wanted to end up on, since again, we don't really have too much time, is that the UN Security Council resolutions should call on the Secretary General and the UN agencies to report particularly on the impact of armed conflicts on children with disabilities in all of the report and people with disabilities in general. So what this would mean is that, for example, the Secretary General should include children with disabilities in his reports on grave violations, not just from the perspective of children have been injured and acquired a disability, which has been the case until now, but actually to discuss their situation as children with disabilities. And I will just end by saying that actually Human Rights Watch has a report now in the pipeline on the situation of children with disabilities in Gaza. And here we talk about both children who have been injured and acquired a disability since October 7, as well as children who have had a disability prior to the current hostilities. And one of the reasons why we did decide to do this research is also to bridge that gap that has existed for like literally decades, where for some reason children who have been injured in the attacks, and the term that's been used by the UN is children who have been maimed, which I would use under quotation marks, since that is a stigmatizing language for people with disabilities. But we do want to bridge the gap for those children to be viewed as children with disabilities who have the rights and needs. So I will end here, and thank you once again for the opportunity to be part of this panel.
Thank you so much, Amina. And unfortunately, I said we would have time for questions, and we will not have time for questions. And I will not do a wrap up either, and I will just go to our last speaker. But thank you all to all the speakers and participants here. If you do have questions, please put them in the chat and even submit them online. What we're planning on doing is to answer your questions in writing afterwards, to have it on the HNPW website so that they will be answered. We'll ask the speakers to answer the questions if possible in writing. So if you do have a burning question, please put it down and please submit it and we will get it to you. So without further ado, we have our closing remarks, our political perspective from His Excellency, Mr. Zegwa, sorry, Czech, and I brutalized your name and I do apologize. I've been practicing since I met you, so I'm very sorry. But he is the permanent representative of the Republic of Poland to the United Nations office at Geneva. I will just ask you to make a few points on that you've noted during the discussion, and also Poland's view as you are a champion of Resolution 2475 and how you see it on next steps for that resolution.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. I would like to thank the organizers for convening this meeting and thank the fellow co-panelists for the discussion on how rights of persons with disabilities can be better safeguarded in humanitarian actions during their armed conflicts. Well, it goes without saying, and this is a common failure of the international community, that the interests of particularly vulnerable and marginalized groups are often overlooked. I tend to think that in crisis, they are being hit twice, not only as victims per se, like other people, but also as persons with particular needs who are overlooked and whose needs are overlooked, not properly addressed in the process of humanitarian response, especially during the very first phases of the conflict. The co-panelists gave us very extensive information on their experience from the field regarding the implementation of the UN Security Council Resolution 2475, showing where the deficiencies are, where the challenges are, where the shortcomings are, and what can be done in order to properly address these challenges and shortcomings regarding the implementation of this resolution. I must tell you that my country, Poland, also experienced the scale of the humanitarian impact of the Russian aggression inflicted on Ukrainian people, also in this aspect of persons with disabilities. Because until spring 2022, Poland hosted at least 15,000 Ukrainian people, persons of disabilities, out of overall million refugees from Ukraine who are present in the Polish territory. And we made a lot of efforts to provide these people with disabilities with extensive and multidimensional support. But even before the Russian aggression against Ukraine, Poland has been a long-standing advocate of vulnerable groups in armed conflicts and humanitarian crises. We believe that UN had and still has a crucial task to fulfill in this matter, especially in the face of growing number of human rights violations in the emerging conflicts. Since the beginning of work on the UN Security Resolution 2475, we set ourselves three main goals aimed at, first, strengthening data collection and reporting on persons with disabilities in conflict. Second, building capacity and knowledge on their rights among peace builders and peacekeepers. And third, empowering persons with disabilities in conflict and post-conflict situation. And I am proud to say that my country was a proponent and a co-author of this resolution, and that it has been consequently, as it has been consequently adopted. Of course, 5 years from now, question arises, what shall be the next step in order to make this resolution being implemented in a better way, addressing in a better way the needs of the persons with disabilities who find themselves among the victims of the armed conflicts. And we believe that the appropriate way to celebrate the 5th anniversary of the 2475 resolution is to step up efforts and discussions regarding the amelioration of the situation of people with disabilities in armed conflicts, but also developing cooperation with various partners, developing partnerships with various stakeholders from various regional groups and organizations aiming at providing adequate help and assistance to people with disabilities in armed conflicts. Of course, we also need to assess the implementation of the resolution as such. You know, I'm a lawyer by education, and I know that in order to make sure that the international legal instrument is properly working, an evaluation needs to be done from time to time in order to make the document work better. In this regard, we recognize the significance of the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy launched by the Secretary General a few years ago in fulfilling the ambition of this set resolution, including by mainstreaming disability inclusion through all the pillars, all the three pillars of the UN work. It is important to keep pace in the ongoing discussion on the topics of various fora. In 2023, Poland has organized, sponsored several side events on the theme of the protection of persons with disabilities in conflict situation, including on the margins of the protection of civilian week and the 16th conference of state parties to the CRPD, together with US, Switzerland, and some other stakeholders. At our request, at Poland's request, but also at the request of several other countries, including Latvia, US, and various non-governmental organizations, it has been possible to include the topic of the rights of persons with disabilities in humanitarian crisis and other situations of risk in the program of the 17th conference of the state parties to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities that is to be held on 11-13 June this year. We are also making efforts to commemorate this anniversary in the UN Security Council with a commemorative debate, briefing, or joint statement. But as we are no longer a member of the United Nations Security Council, our options are, I must admit it, are limited there. Nonetheless, we will be striving to ensure that the legacy of the resolution 2475 is properly reflected and that the substantive actions are taken in order to make these documents a real achievement and a real and efficient instrument of help, of providing help to people with disabilities who find themselves among the victims of the armed conflict. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And with that, we are over time. I'm just going to remind everyone of one thing is that this can all be found online, the recording of this session. So if you wish to go back and review it, to ask questions, the questions and answers should be put online afterwards. I'll defer to Isabel from OSHA to do that. That is not my my area of expertise. But also, please, for anyone who hasn't done so, visit the first floor photo exhibit on change makers in action, building disability inclusion resilient communities. It's a very, important aspect to have persons with disabilities visible and them, at the forefront. So it's just up the escalators on the first floor for those that are interested. And thank you all for coming and attending, both in person and online. And hopefully we'll continue this discussion moving forward. Thank you.